welcome. You've arrived at another calm journey through the past, here at Boring History for Sleep. Settle in, allow your body to rest, and let the world outside this moment slowly fade. We are not here for battles or kings tonight. We are here to walk softly among the ordinary people of history. The forgotten villagers, the quiet streets, the small sounds of daily life. No rush, no excitementally, a slow unfolding of what life once was. Imagine yourself drifting into a different century where the rhythm of life was guided not by clocks, but by the rise and fall of the sun, and by the toll of the church bell. Tonight, our journey begins in a medieval village, a place of wooden cottages with thatched roofs, a place of damp soil, low smoke, and quiet footsteps in the morning. Here, the life of a peasant moves in circles, from field to hearth, from season to season. Why it sucked to be a medieval peasant, imagine. You wake before the light. The room is cool and dark. The walls are rough, woven from wooden beams, stuffed with clay. Above you, the roof of straw whispers faintly as the wind brushes across it. The smell is familiar smoke from last night's fire, the faint must of damp earth, and perhaps the sour scent of ale brewing in a corner. Your bed is not soft. It is a heap of straw, sometimes shared with family members. In winter, the air inside the cottage is sharp, and your breath lingers in small clouds. You rise slowly. There is no candle unless you are lucky. Instead, the gray of dawn enters through a gap in the wooden shutter. You move toward the door, and the cold earth floor meets your feet. Outside, the village is waking. A dog stirs near the doorway. Somewhere, a chicken flutters its wings, and the faint sound of hooves comes from the small pasture. The rhythm of life is always the same. Fetch water from the well. It is heavy, the bucket pulling down on your shoulders. The rope creaks as you draw it up. You carry it back, your arms aching even before the day's work begins. Bread is stale this morning. It always is. The loaf is hard, baked days before. You soften it in a thin broth, flavored only by onions, or perhaps a turnip saved from the last harvest. Meat is rare. Salted fish sometimes. Cheese when the cow has given enough milk. But most days, the bread must be enough. By mid-morning, the fields call. The soil is dark and sticky after rain. You bend, you sow, you reap, depending on the season. Your back stiffens quickly, but the rhythm of the work continues. Birdsong fills the hedgerows. The sound of iron tools strikes the earth again and again. This is the cycle of the peasant's life. Day after day, season after season, little changes. The church bell marks Sunday, a pause in the week's labor. But even that day is filled with duties. The rhythm of their lives was steady, but it was also heavy, like the weight of the water bucket each morning. At night, the cottage grows dark again. The fire is the only light. The smoke clings to your hair and clothes. You sit, perhaps mending a tool, listening to the crackle of flames. Children may whisper or drift to sleep, curled together on straw. And slowly, with the sound of the wind outside and the faint glow of embers, the day fades and the rhythm.
In the stillness of the medieval countryside, sometime in the 12th century, there was a boy whose life began in ordinary quietness. His name was not carried through the centuries, for he was not a king or a knight or a poet. He was simply one among many children born to a peasant household in a small village. And yet, like many before him, the rhythm of his life would carry him from the smoke of the hearth to the stone walls of a monastery. The boy was born into a world of wood and earth. His earliest memories and the smell of straw bedding, damp after a season of rain. He would have woken to the faint sound of roosters in the yard and the muffled clatter of pots as his mother prepared what little food there was. The rhythm of those days was simple and often heavy. As a child, he carried small burdens, a wooden bucket of water, a bundle of kindling, or a sack of grain too large for his thin arms. He would have watched the older men till the earth, guiding plows through stubborn soil, while women spun thread or baked coarse loaves of bread. He learned early that life was a cycle of labor, punctuated by the sound of the church bell on holy days. The church was the largest building he knew. Its walls of stone stood firm above the wooden cottages, its roof catching the light of the sun. On Sundays, he walked with his family through the muddy path to its door. Inside, the air was cool and dim. Candles flickered against the walls, and the smell of wax mixed with incense. He could not read the Latin words spoken by the priest, but he absorbed the rhythm of the chants, the echo of voices rising into the rafters, the sense that within those walls time moved differently. This was the seed of something within him, though he did not yet know it. The church represented more than ritual. It was a place where silence was kept, where words were written in books that most could not understand, and where men lived apart from the toil of the village. As he grew, his family noticed that he was quiet by nature. He worked when asked, but he often paused, staring at the fields or the sky as though listening to something others could not hear. He asked questions that had no easy answer, about the stars, about why the seasons turned, about what became of people when they faded with the winter. His father sometimes shook his head at this, better to keep hands busy than to wander in thought, but his mother saw a softness in him, and perhaps she guessed he was not meant for the plow. The local priest, too, noticed the boy's stillness. Sometimes, after Mass, the boy lingered near the church door, watching the candles. The priest spoke to him gently, asking if he wished to learn letters. At first, the boy hesitated, for no one in his family could read. But slowly, under the patient guidance of the priest, he began to scratch the shapes of letters on a wax tablet. He learned the Psalms, not only by hearing them, but by seeing their words unfold on the page. The strange shapes of Latin became familiar, and though he did not understand all their meanings, he learned to copy them, stroke by stroke. For his family, this was a small wonder. To have a son who could read even a little was unusual. They were proud, though they did not fully grasp what it meant. For the boy, the letters opened a quiet path, one that seemed to lead away from the fields, toward a world of parchment, prayer, and silence. By the time he reached the edge of adolescence, the thought of joining a monastery had taken root. The idea was not dramatic. It came slowly, like the turning of a season. He did not dream of glory or power. He simply felt drawn to the stillness of stone cloisters, to the sound of chanting voices rising and falling like the tide. In the village, his life would be bound to the earth, plowing, sowing, reaping, generation after generation. But in the monastery, he imagined another kind of rhythm, the hours marked by bells, the days by prayer, the seasons by illuminated manuscripts. His parents, though reluctant to see him go, understood. A son in the monastery was both an honor and a form of security. It meant one less mouth to feed at home, and perhaps blessings for the family's soul. So, when he was of the right age, perhaps 14, perhaps 15, they allowed him to go. The journey was not far. Many monasteries lay within a few days' walk of any village. The boy, now a novice, traveled with the priest who had first taught him his letters. The road was quiet, bordered by hedgerows and scattered cottages. He carried little with him: a bundle of coarse clothing, a small loaf of bread, and the faint tremor of uncertainty. At last they reached the monastery. Its walls of stone loomed above the fields, not grand like the cathedrals of cities, but solid, weathered, and enduring. The great wooden door creaked open, and the boy stepped inside. He was met by a hush deeper than any he had known in the village. The air smelled of beeswax, of herbs growing in the cloister garden, of parchment ink drying on desks where monks bent their heads in silence. Here he would begin again, not as a son of peasants, not as a farm boy with dirt beneath his nails, but as a novice. His days would now follow the toll of bells, matins in the deep of night, lauds at dawn, prime in the morning, and so on through the hours. He would rise not for the plow, but for prayer. He would bend not only over soil, but over pages of vellum. The entry into the monastery was not sudden transformation. It was slow, like the unfolding of a long winter into spring. At first, he struggled with the strictness, the silence, the fasting, the endless prayers in a tongue not his own. But gradually, the rhythm seeped into him. The monastery became the frame of his life. And so the boy faded into the monk he would become. His name was entered in the rolls, though few would ever read it. His family returned to their fields, his village to its labor. But within the stone walls, the boy's life took on a new pattern: prayer, study, and service. It was the beginning of a path that would last the whole of his days, a path marked not by noise or triumph, but by the steady, calming rhythm of monastic life. The boy who had entered as a novice soon learned that the monastery was a world with its own pulse, a world ordered not by seasons alone, but by bells. The bells were the heartbeat of monastic life. They tolled in the stillness of night, they rang in the gray of dawn, they echoed across cloisters at midday, and they sounded again at dusk. Each chime marked not merely the hour, but a sacred pause, a call to prayer, a reminder that time itself belonged not to men, but to God. For the monk, each day began long before sunrise. The first bell, the summons to matins, came in the deepest hours of the night. He would rise from his narrow bed, the straw rustling faintly beneath his weight, the cold of stone seeping into his feet. The dormitory was a long hall, lined with other monks who moved in quiet unison, each gathering their robes in silence. No one spoke. The only sounds were the shuffle of sandals against the floor and the faint groan of wood as doors opened to the night air. They moved together toward the church, the cloisters dim and hushed, the sky outside scattered with stars. Sometimes, in winter, their breath would rise in pale clouds, mingling with the smoke of torches lit to guide their way. Inside the church, the air was heavy with the scent of wax and incense. Candles flickered in tall holders, casting soft light across stone walls. There, in the stillness, the voices began to rise low, steady, unhurried. The chanting of psalms, in Latin, a language the monk did not at first fully understand, but one whose rhythm sank into his bones. The night office of matins could last for hours. Verses were sung, prayers recited, lessons read aloud from Scripture. Sometimes his eyelids grew heavy and he fought the weight of sleep. Yet, over time, the repetition soothed him, as though the words themselves were a tide, carrying him gently from wakefulness to devotion. When matins ended, the monks did not return fully to rest. Instead, they moved through lauds, the prayer of dawn, offered as the first light began to touch the horizon. Birds stirred in the monastery gardens, and the first warmth of the sun brushed against the cloister walls. By the time the prayers concluded, the sky had shifted from black to pale gray, and another day had begun. Only then did the monks allow themselves a brief return to their beds. Sleep was short, no more than a fragment of rest. Soon enough, the bell called them against to prime, the morning office, marking the true beginning of work. The rhythm of the day unfolded with a steady predictability. After prime, they gathered in the chapter house, where readings were shared, and the abbot gave instructions for the day. Silence was expected, save for the necessary words spoken in order. The monk listened as tasks were assigned, some to the gardens, some to the library, some to the kitchen or the scriptorium. For him, the work often lay in the gardens or in copying texts. In the gardens, he bent over rows of herbs, their scents rising in the cool morning air. Mint, thyme, sage, and rosemary grew alongside medicinal plants, comfrey for healing, valerian for sleep, fennel for digestion. The monks tended these carefully, for they were both food and medicine. The soil crumbled softly between his fingers, damp from dew, and the rhythm of weeding, planting, harvesting brought a quiet satisfaction. On other days, he was called to the scriptorium. There, the light filtered through narrow windows, illuminating wooden desks. Parchment sheets lay before him, smooth and pale, prepared from animal skin. Ink, dark and rich, rested in a small pot beside a sharpened quill. His task was not to invent, but to preserve. He copied lines of scripture, one after another, each letter shaped with precision. The work was slow, requiring patience and focus. Mistakes were carefully scraped away with a knife, then rewritten. Hours slipped by unnoticed as he bent over the page, the scratch of quill against parchment the only sound. The bells continued to guide him. At mid-morning, Terce summoned the community to prayer again. The monks left their tasks, washed their hands, and filed once more into the church. Their voices rose, chanting psalms as sunlight poured through high windows. When the prayers ended, they returned to their labor, the rhythm uninterrupted, as though the day itself was a weaving of work and worship. one thread of silence interlaced with another of song. At midday came sext, and with it the first true meal of the day. The refectory was a long hall with wooden benches and tables. The monks sat in rows, their heads bowed. Meals were simple: bread, vegetables from the garden, perhaps fish on certain days, cheese when available. Meat was rare, permitted only on limited occasions. As they ate, there was no chatter, no laughter, no exchange of stories. Instead, one monk read aloud from a lectern, his voice steady as he recited scripture or the life of a saint. The words filled the hall as the sound of chewing and the clink of wooden spoons blended quietly beneath it. After the meal, a period of rest followed. In summer, this was a welcome pause from the heat. In winter, a time to regain warmth near the fire. Some monks walked in the cloister, their footsteps echoing beneath stone arches. Others returned briefly to their beds, closing their eyes against the heaviness of food and fatigue. But soon the bell rang again, calling them to none. The afternoon office, the pattern repeated: prayer, then labor. The monk returned to his task, whether in the garden or the scriptorium, or sometimes assisting in the infirmary, where herbs were prepared for the sick, poultices laid upon wounds, and weary travelers were given bread and rest. As the sun began its slow descent, vespers arrived. This was the evening prayer, one of the most beautiful, when the light of the setting sun filtered through colored glass, casting soft hues across the stone. The chants rose, echoing through the church, their cadence both solemn and soothing. The day's work was nearly done. The final meal came after vespers, lighter than the midday one. Again, silence was kept, readings shared. Then came Compline, the last prayer of the day, held in near darkness. Candles flickered, shadows deepened, and the monks' voices lowered as they sang the closing hymns. The words carried a sense of completion, of release, of the world settling into stillness. When Compline ended, silence was absolute. The monks returned to their dormitory, each slipping into his narrow bed. Outside, the village beyond the monastery walls had long since quieted. Stars glimmered in the sky, and the faint sound of wind rustled the trees. Within the cloister, all was calm. And then, as the monk closed his eyes, the rhythm began again. Hours would pass, the bell would sound, and once more he would rise to matins in the depth of night. This cycle was not for a day nor a week, but for a lifetime. The repetition, so strict, so unchanging, became a form of peace. There was no question of what tomorrow would bring. The hours were set, the prayers known, the tasks familiar. In that predictability lay a profound quiet, the kind of quiet that seemed to stretch beyond a single life, connecting one monk to another across centuries. For the monk, the daily rhythm became not a burden, but a steady current. It carried him forward without haste, without expectation, without the turbulence of worldly ambition. The monastery was his world, and its heartbeat was the bell. As the years unfolded, one after another, the monk's life in the monastery settled into a pattern so familiar, so unchanging, that decades slipped by almost unnoticed. His youth had been spent learning the rhythm, his middle years spent living it fully, and then, in time, he found himself entering a season of life marked by slowness, by gentleness, by the steady drift of age. The signs of aging arrived quietly. At first, they appeared as small aches, the stiffness of knees after long hours in the garden, the weariness in his shoulders after bending over parchment. His eyes, once sharp, began to blur as the letters on the page danced faintly in the dim light of the scriptorium. Where once he had risen easily at the bell for matins, now his body was slower to respond. Yet he rose still, leaning on habit as much as strength. The younger monks noticed his careful steps, his hands that sometimes trembled, his voice that wavered slightly in the chants. But in the monastery, age was not a burden. It was accepted as part of the same rhythm that carried them all. The older monks became quiet examples of endurance. There lives a reminder that time in the cloister was not measured by achievement, but by faithfulness. His days remained the same, but their pace slowed. In the gardens, he no longer carried the heaviest loads. Instead, he guided novices, showing them where to plant herbs, how to prune vines, how to recognize when the soil was ready. His hands moved more gently now, not with the energy of youth, but with the care of long familiarity. In the scriptorium, he copied fewer lines each day, but the letters he traced were steady, each stroke deliberate. Prayer, always the heart of monastic life, deepened for him in these years. The words of the Psalms, repeated thousands upon thousands of times, no longer felt like tasks to complete. They were like breath itself, woven into him, rising and falling as naturally as the rhythm of walking or sleeping. When he sang, his voice blended with the others, and though it was weaker, it carried a depth born of decades. As seasons turned, he watched novices arrive just as he once had. He watched them stumble through their first prayers, struggle with silence, grow restless with the strictness of the rule. And slowly, he watched them adjust, just as he had, until the rhythm shaped them too. His own presence, steady and calm, became part of their learning, though he seldom gave long speeches or instructions. Simply by being there, by rising at the bell, by bending to tend the herbs, by turning the pages of Scripture with care, he taught what it meant to endure. The monastery itself aged with him, stones weathered, roofs repaired, gardens replanted. Yet the rhythm of bells never changed. The same prayers he had sung as a novice echoed still unchanged by time. The same halls he had walked in youth carried his slower steps in old age. The continuity gave comfort, as though his life were part of a great circle, one that had begun long before his birth and would continue long after. In winter, he moved more slowly. The cold seeped into his bones, and he wrapped his robes tighter against the chill. In summer, he found shade in the cloister, sitting where the stone arches cast long shadows across the grass. His hands folded quietly in his lap, his eyes sometimes closing, not in sleep, but in rest. He listened to the sounds around him, birds in the garden, the distant scratching of quills, the low murmur of voices in prayer. All were familiar, like the repeating verses of a song. As the years deepened, his body grew frailer. The time came when he could no longer rise easily in the night for matins. Younger brothers helped him to his place in the choir. He held on to their arms as he walked, his steps slow, but his desire to be present never wavering. When his voice faltered, he whispered the psalms under his breath, the words so ingrained in him that they came without effort. Eventually, his duties lessened. He no longer copied texts, no longer tended the herbs. His work was simply to be, to pray, to rest in the rhythm he had known all his life. He sat more often in the cloister garden, the sun warm on his face, the smell of lavender and rosemary drifting in the air. Novices greeted him with bowed heads, and he answered with a soft smile. The end of his life approached as gently as the close of a day. There was no sudden break, no drama, only a slow fading, as though the light of the candle he had carried all his life was burning lower, smaller, softer. When illness came, it was not with violence. It was like the steady change of season, the body yielding to time, the breath slowing, the strength waning. In his final days, he was confined to a narrow bed in the infirmary. Brothers tended to him with quiet care, bringing water, adjusting blankets, whispering prayers beside him. He no longer rose for the bells, but the sound of them drifted through the stone walls, reaching his ears as he lay still. Even in weakness, the rhythm was with him, the chant of psalms, the toll of bells, the soft murmur of prayers said on his behalf. On his last evening, the sun set as it always had, spilling golden light through the narrow window of the infirmary. He lay with eyes half closed, his breath shallow, his hands folded on his chest. The voices of the monks carried faintly from the chapel nearby, their chants weaving through the air, and as the light faded, so too did he gently, quietly, without struggle. The brothers gathered around him after. They prayed, they sang, they commended his soul. There was no grand monument, no written legacy beyond the pages he had copied, the herbs he had tended, the prayers he had spoken. His name was recorded in the necrology of the house, listed simply among the others who had passed before him. Yet his life was not lost. It was part of the rhythm of the monastery itself, woven into its walls, its gardens, its chants. For decades he had risen at the bell, sung the psalms, tended the earth, copied the sacred texts. He had lived quietly, faithfully, without striving for remembrance. And in that quietness, he embodied what it meant to be a monk, a man who surrendered his days to a rhythm greater than his own. And so, his story ends not with noise, but with silence. A silence that was not emptiness, but fullness. A silence that was the natural close of a long, steady song. The quiet biography of a medieval monk in the stillness of the medieval countryside. Sometime in the 12th century, there was a boy whose life began in ordinary quietness. His name was not carried through the centuries, for he was not a king or a knight or a poet. He was simply one among many children born to a peasant household in a small village. And yet, like many before him, the rhythm of his life would carry him from the smoke of the hearth to the stone walls of a monastery. The boy was born into a world of wood and earth. His earliest memories, though never written, would have been of a thatched roof low overhead and the smell of straw bedding, damp after a season of rain. He would have woken to the faint sound of roosters in the yard and the muffled clatter of pots as his mother prepared what little food there was. The rhythm of those days was simple and often heavy. As a child, he carried small burdens, a wooden bucket of water, a bundle of kindling, or a sack of grain too large for his thin arms. He would have watched the older men till the earth, guiding plows through stubborn soil, while women spun thread or baked coarse loaves of bread. He learned early that life was a cycle of labor, punctuated by the sound of the church bell on holy days. The church was the largest building he knew. Its walls of stone stood firm above the wooden cottages, its roof catching the light of the sun. On Sundays, he walked with his family through the muddy path to its door. Inside, the air was cool and dim. Candles flickered against the walls, and the smell of wax mixed with incense. He could not read the Latin words spoken by the priest, but he absorbed the rhythm of the chants, the echo of voices rising into the rafters, the sense that within those walls, time moved differently. This was the seed of something within him. The church represented more than ritual. It was a place where silence was kept, where words were written in books that most could not understand, and where men lived apart from the toil of the village. As he grew, his family noticed that he was quiet by nature. He worked when asked, but he often paused, staring at the fields or the sky as though listening to something others could not hear. He asked questions that had no easy answer, about the stars, about why the seasons turned, about what became of people when they faded with the winter. His father sometimes shook his head at this, better to keep hands busy than to wander in thought, but his mother saw a softness in him, and perhaps she guessed he was not meant for the plow. The local priest noticed the boy's stillness. Sometimes, after Mass, the boy lingered near the church door, watching the candles. The priest spoke to him gently, asking if he wished to learn letters. At first, the boy hesitated, for no one in his family could read. But slowly, under the patient guidance of the priest, he began to scratch the shapes of letters on a wax tablet. He learned the Psalms not only by hearing them, but by seeing their words unfold on the page. For his family, this was a small wonder. To have a son who could read even a little was unusual. For the boy, the letters opened a path, one that seemed to lead away from the fields, toward a world of parchment, prayer, and silence. By the time he reached adolescence, the thought of joining a monastery had taken root. The idea was not dramatic. It came slowly, like the turning of a season. In the village, his life would be bound to the earth. But in the monastery, he imagined another kind of rhythm. The hours marked by bells, the days by prayer, the seasons by illuminated manuscripts. When he was of the right age, perhaps 14, perhaps 15, his parents allowed him to go. The journey to the monastery was not far. The great wooden door creaked open, and he stepped inside. He was met by a hush deeper than any he had known in the village. The air smelled of beeswax, of herbs growing in the cloister garden, of parchment ink drying on desks where monks bent their heads in silence. Here, he began, again not as a son of peasants, but as a novice. His days would now follow the toll of bells, matins in the deep of night, lauds at dawn, prime in the morning, and so on through the hours. He would rise not for the plow, but for prayer. He would bend not only over soil, but over pages of vellum. Slowly, the rhythm seeped into him. The monastery became the frame of his life, shaping each day with quiet persistence. The monastery was a world with its own pulse. The bells were its heartbeat, tolling in the night, at dawn, at noon, at dusk. Each chime marked not merely the hour, but a sacred pause, a call to prayer, a reminder that time itself belonged not to men, but to God. For the monk, each day began long before sunrise. The first bell, the summons to matins, came in the deepest hours of the night. He rose from his narrow bed, the straw rustling faintly beneath his weight, the cold of stone seeping into his feet. With the others, he walked silently to the church, where candlelight flickered across stone. There, the chanting of psalms began, low, steady, unhurried. The night office of matins could last for hours. Verses were sung, prayers recited, lessons read aloud. Sometimes his eyelids grew heavy, yet over time the repetition soothed him, as though the words themselves were a tide, carrying him gently from wakefulness to devotion. Lauds followed, welcoming the dawn. Then prime, the morning prayer, and the gathering in the chapter house. Work was assigned, some to gardens, some to the scriptorium, some to kitchens. His work alternated sometimes in the herb gardens, bending over rows of mint, thyme, sage, and rosemary. sometimes in the scriptorium, tracing letters carefully on parchment, the quill scratching softly as hours slipped by unnoticed. At terce they paused for prayer again, then back to labor. At sext, midday prayers led into the first meal of the day. Silence was kept as one monk read aloud from Scripture or the life of a saint. Afterward, a short rest, then none, and more work. Vespers marked evening, the light of the setting sun casting colors through stained glass. Compline closed the day, prayers whispered in near darkness, and then silence, absolute, until the bell for matins rang again. This was the rhythm of his life, repeated every day, every year. Work, prayer, silence, rest. The repetition became peace itself. The comfort of knowing each moment was part of a pattern larger than himself. As the years unfolded, the monk's hair turned gray, his hands slowed, his back bent. The rhythm continued, but his part in it softened. He no longer carried heavy loads, but guided novices in their work. He copied fewer lines of text, but each stroke was deliberate. His voice in prayer weakened, but it carried a depth born of decades. He became an example, not by words, but by presence. By rising still at the bell, by bowing his head in prayer, by sitting quietly in the cloister garden, he showed what it meant to endure in the rhythm. Eventually, his strength waned. He could no longer rise for matins without aid. His steps slowed, his hands trembled. Duties passed to younger monks. His work was now only to pray, to rest, to embody the stillness he had sought all his life. When illness came, it was gentle, like the turning of a season. He lay in the infirmary, listening to the bells, the chants, the quiet murmur of brothers around him. On his final evening, the sun set through a narrow window, golden light spilling across his bed. The voices of the monks drifted faintly from the chapel, and as the light faded, so too did he gently, quietly, without struggle. His name was recorded in the necrology, listed simply among the others. No monument, no fame, yet his life was not lost. It was part of the monastery's rhythm, woven into its chants, its gardens, its walls. He had lived quietly, faithfully, surrendering his days to a pattern greater than his own. And so his story closed as it had been lived, without noise, without haste, but with silence that was not emptiness, but fullness. A silence that was the natural close of a long, steady song. Rituals of the seasons. The gentle turning of the medieval year. Imagine yourself standing in a medieval village square, where the air is filled, not with urgency, but with the quiet pulse of life lived close to the land. For those who lived in the Middle Ages, time itself did not flow as it does for us, broken into minutes and seconds. Instead, it was measured by bells, by the slow length of a candle burning, by the rising and setting of the sun, and most deeply, by the rhythm of the seasons. The year was not just a span of days, it was a circle, turning again and again. Each season carried its own rituals, its own quiet customs, its own place in the lives of villagers, peasants, and even nobles. These rituals bound people together, reminding them that they were part of something larger than their own small households. Winter, the deep stillness and the light of midwinter. In the depth of winter, the medieval world grew silent. Fields lay fallow, covered in frost or snow. Days were short, nights long. Work in the fields ceased, replaced by small domestic tasks, mending tools, spinning wool, repairing roofs. And yet, within the darkness of winter, rituals brought light. Midwinter feasts were among the most important of the year. The Christian festival of Christmas was celebrated, but woven through it were older customs, traces of earlier rituals to honor the returning sun. In a village hall or manor, a great log, the Yule log, was placed on the hearth, meant to burn steadily for days, its flames a symbol of endurance through the darkest nights. In monasteries, the chants of Advent gave way to the joy of Christmas Mass, sung in candlelit chapels. For peasants, the ritual was simpler but deeply felt. Special bread baked with spices, carols sung, evergreen branches hung to remind them that life endured even in the dead of winter. On the Feast of Epiphany, villages sometimes carried out small processions. Children dressed as the Magi, following a star carved from wood or painted on cloth. This was not done with grandeur, but with quiet reverence, an enactment of mystery in the frozen stillness of January. Spring, renewal, and Easter's quiet mysteries. As winter receded, the first signs of spring were met with relief and hope. Snow melted, rivers swelled, buds appeared on bare branches. For medieval people, these changes were not background, they were the very markers of survival. Rituals of spring focused on renewal, on blessing, and on preparation for planting. Ash Wednesday and Lent called for fasting and prayer, a slow cleansing of body and spirit. Villagers ate simple meals, gruel, bread, dried fish, waiting for the abundance of warmer months. Palm Sunday brought processions where branches, sometimes willow, if palms could not be found, were carried and blessed. Holy Week unfolded slowly, with Maundy Thursday foot washings, Good Friday's solemn silence, and then the vigil of Easter Eve, when fire was kindled outside the church and carried in, a small flame spreading from candle to candle until the entire space glowed with light. Imagine that moment, the hush of night, broken only by the crackling of the new flame, the chant of monks or priests, and the sight of hundreds of candles illuminating stone walls. For those present, it was not just ritual, it was reassurance, a reminder that light returned after darkness, that life returned after death. Summer, work, feast, and the long days. Summer was a season of both toil and celebration. The fields demanded long hours, for crops had to be tended, hay gathered, animals grazed. Yet, within the hard work, rituals gave structure and moments of rest. Feast days of saints punctuated the calendar. On the feast of John the Baptist in June, fires were kindled on hillsides, echoing older midsummer bonfires. People sang, danced, and leaped over embers, gestures meant to bring luck and health for the coming year. Corpus Christi processions filled the streets in towns with banners waving, the Eucharist carried beneath a canopy, and flowers strewn underfoot. For villagers, these rituals reminded them that even in their labor, the sacred was near. The summer months also brought markets and fairs. Though not formal rituals, they became communal events where songs, games, and trading wove together into a tapestry of seasonal life. The smell of roasted meats, the sound of flutes, the sight of brightly dyed cloth created an atmosphere that broke the monotony of daily work. Autumn, harvest, Thanksgiving, and the turning toward rest. Autumn was the season of gathering. Grain was cut, threshed, and stored. Grapes were pressed for wine. Apples were harvested, dried, or made into cider. The air smelled of smoke from hearths and of damp earth, heavy with fallen leaves. Harvest rituals were simple but deeply symbolic. The last sheaf of grain was often saved, tied with ribbon, and placed in the home as a charm for fertility and good fortune in the next year's crop. In some villages, this sheaf was even dressed as a figure, honored as the spirit of the field. Feasts followed the harvest. Tables were laid with what abundance could be spared: roasted fowl, bread from new grain, vegetables freshly dug from the soil. These gatherings were not extravagant, but they were heartfelt, an acknowledgment of survival and provision. As autumn deepened, All Hallows' Eve and All Saints' Day approached. The air grew colder, nights longer, and thoughts turned to those who had gone before. Candles were lit in remembrance. Prayers were said for the departed. Villagers might place small offerings or food for wandering souls, a quiet blending of Christian belief and older customs. The year as a circle through winter's stillness, spring's renewal, summer's abundance, and autumn's gathering. The medieval year turned. Each ritual was not separate, but part of a whole, a cycle repeated across generations. For the people who lived then, rituals were not luxuries. They were anchors, grounding lives that were otherwise fragile and uncertain. The bell of a church, the lighting of a candle, the sharing of bread, all were ways of finding stability, of weaving meaning into the passage of time. And as the year turned again, as winter returned, so too did the rituals, familiar and steady, shaping life into a rhythm that mirrored the eternal. Within the castle walls, the quiet lives of the medieval elite. Imagine now that you step away from the muddy tracks of the village, away from the cottages of Watteau and Daub, and walk slowly toward stone walls that rise above the landscape, not gleaming but gray and weathered. Its towers cast shadows across the land, its gates creak as they open. Within, life follows a different rhythm. The lives of nobles were not free of hardship, but they were shaped by privilege and responsibility. Let us walk softly through their days, noticing what was different and what remained at heart the same. The halls and chambers. Inside the castle, the air is cooler, carrying the scent of stone and smoke. The great hall stretches wide, its timber-bird roof high above. Rushes are spread across the floor, mixed with herbs like lavender or rosemary to sweeten the scent of daily life. At one end sits a long wooden table where the lord and lady preside. Tapestries hang on the walls, not only for beauty, but for warmth, depicting saints, battles, or quiet patterns of flowers. Beyond the hall are smaller chamber solar rooms, where light enters through narrow windows. Here the lady of the castle might sit, spinning or reading from a prayer book. The furniture is not abundant, but carefully made. Carved chests, wooden stools, the occasional cushioned chair. Beds are large, heaped with furs and heavy blankets to keep out the chill. Where a peasant's home held smoke and thatch, the castle held stone and firelight. It was not always comfortable, but it carried a sense of permanence. The rhythm of a noble's day. A noble's day began not with toil in the fields, but with ritual and duty. The morning might open with prayer, a moment in the chapel where candles flickered and voices echoed in chant. Afterward, the lord would hear petitions, peasants or tenants bringing concerns about land, disputes, or payments. His role was not only to rule, but to mediate, to act as both protector and judge. Meals were more abundant than those of villagers, yet still simple compared to modern tables. Bread, meat, and fish appeared often, seasoned with herbs, sometimes with imported spices if wealth allowed. Meals were taken in the hall, served by attendants, with music or recitations to accompany them. The clatter of wooden trenchers, the soft hum of conversation, the occasional barking of dogs at their master's feet. This was the sound of dining in a noble household. The lady's rhythm was different. She oversaw the running of the household, managed servants, and ensured supplies were maintained. She also embroidered, read devotional texts, and taught children. Life was not idle, but structured. Education and leisure for noble children. Education was a privilege. Boys might learn Latin, scripture, and the skills of warfare, how to ride, how to use sword and shield. Girls were taught reading, music, and the arts of running a household. Leisure was shaped by their station. Hunting was a favored pastime, a ritual of its own. Imagine a hunting party setting out at dawn. The blowing of horns, hounds barking, riders cloaked against the chill. It was less about the chase itself, and more about the display of skill, the confirmation of status. Music filled their halls, harps, flutes, soft singing in the evenings. Stories were told by traveling minstrels, weaving romances of knights and ladies of far-off lands. These tales were entertainment, but also mirrors of ideals, chivalry, loyalty, honor, responsibilities, and burdens. Yet life as a noble was not only comfort. With privilege came responsibility. The castle walls were not just for grandeur, they were for defense. Nobles had to raise men for battle, to swear loyalty to kings, to provide protection for the villages under their care. Even in times of peace, the weight of obligation was constant. The lady of the castle carried her own burdens, ensuring alliances through marriage, maintaining hospitality, caring for the poor at the gate. These duties were quiet but steady, threads that wove the household into the wider world. The contrast with the village. When we look from the castle down to the village below, the differences are clear. One lived in stone, the other in timber. One ate venison and spiced dishes, the other rye, bread, and porridge. One wore linen and wool dyed in bright colors, the other rough homespun, and yet both noble and peasant shared the same turning seasons. Both relied on harvest, both felt the bite of winter's cold, both marked time by bells and festivals. In their differences, they were still connected, each dependent on the other. The gentle passing of a noble life as evening falls within the castle. Torches flicker along the corridors. The great hall grows quiet, and families retreat to their chambers. Outside, peasants settle into their cottages, fires dimming. Inside, nobles draw curtains around their beds, whispering prayers before sleep. The life of a noble, though elevated, was still bound by the same rhythms, the cycle of prayer, of meal, of work, of rest. Their stone walls could shield them from wind and rain, but not from time itself. And so, just as peasants turned their lives to the seasons, so too did the nobility. The rhythm of their lives was different in scale, but not in essence. All were carried by the same turning of the year, the same slow passage of days, the same quiet march of centuries. Closing reflection. As we leave the castle walls behind, we carry with us the sense that history is not only grand events, but the soft repetition of daily life. Whether in a village hut or a lord's chamber, the rhythm of medieval existence was steady, measured, and shared. And now, as our journey through these 4 segments comes to rest, imagine yourself drifting back from the medieval world. The bells have rung, the candles are dimmed, and the people, monks, peasants, nobles are all settling into sleep. Their world, though distant, was shaped by cycles not unlike our own. May that rhythm, slow and enduring, carry you gently into rest.